Hello, and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. This is the third video on the prologue of House of Chains, book four of the Malazan Book of the Fallen by Stephen Erikson. So in the first video I did, talked a bit about how Erikson set the scene for this prologue, gave us a description of the setting, and placed us in that so that we had a comprehension of where this narrative was occurring. The second was more about all of the details, how they tied in and how it built up this sense of importance. And all of it was thematically tied and looking at these transitions. And then that signaled then coming into this third video about this third sort of element that we are going to see, which is the human perspective, the person, the character perspective of what is going on. Because all those initial descriptions, that entire way of looking at this, we see was from this perspective, not necessarily from his mind, not necessarily we were inside his thoughts, but the narrative was focalized. It was this close third person narration. The narrator was telling us, showing us what this person was experiencing and letting that point of view color and shape what we were being shown. And so there was a clear progression from the physical reality through to giving it depth and texture, linking it thematically to the thing that had occurred. And now we're being introduced to this consciousness that has shaped this perception. And that is Trull Sengar. So the first thing I'm going to look at is how Trull, we have this transition where we're now dealing directly with how Trull is perceiving immediately around him. Big scope in the opening, and we're now narrowing down what Trull is looking at. And then the second part of this video, I'm not going to do as close a reading and focus so much on the actual language, but talk about it more generally in terms of theme, because there's quite a bit of text left, and I don't want to spend 2 hours reading this and analyzing every single word. I think I have hit on all the sort of major points and techniques and ways of looking at this that now, when you read it, you can go through and know how to, or at least have these additional tools as to how to unpick and unpack all of this different language and trace out the patterns and trace out how this is being constructed. So Trull had said that the shoreline ahead probably did not deserve the word. That was where we had left off in the previous video. Bodies on his left, a sheer drop of 7, maybe 8 man heights to his right, the top of the wall itself slightly less than 30 paces across, that it held back an entire sea whispered of sorcery. So again, remember, when we saw that description of the crabs as coin-sized, when we saw the description of the spiders as wagon wheel-sized, and the description of distance measured in paddle strokes, all of this makes much more sense because it's coming from this person, Trull Sengar. And here we have very explicitly bodies on his left. So we're getting a sense of where he is. The bodies we know are on the shoreline. So we know the water is to his left. That's where the bodies are. And it is a sheer drop of 7, maybe 8, a sheer drop of 7, maybe 8 man heights to his right. So to his left, the shoreline, that's where the bodies are. To his right, it's at least 8 man heights. So again, measuring things in terms of the size that he is relative to him, his perspective. And the top of the wall itself, slightly less than 30 paces across. Again, focused on how he measures it relative to himself. And if you recall at the beginning, the date stamp was all about the day, how many days into the search. Again, this idea of focalization, measuring things according to the individual or to the very, very specific, not measuring things on an imperial scale or a planet-wide scale or a civilization scale, but something very personal to a society, to a culture, to a tribe, to a family, something specific. How many days into the search? Now, looking at this description, we're now getting a sense of the scale, 6 or 7 man heights. For the sake of argument, you could probably calculate that. But it held back an entire sea, whispered of sorcery. We had the Warren referenced, and now we have that this wall is not a natural barrier. It is not even a sort of mundanely constructed barrier, that this wall itself is unnatural, that this border is an unnatural or magical creation. So we have sorcery, the Warren being destroyed or the rent occurring, leading to the destruction of this world. But in some ways, another barrier, another magical element is preventing that destruction spilling elsewhere. So we seem to be in the space between one Warren and another, or one world and another, or somewhere, because off to the right, this drop, we still don't know what's there. There's just, so far in our heads, there's nothingness. We have the water, the shoreline, the wall with the bodies. And that's all to Troll's left. To the right, 30 paces away, there's an edge and it drops down. To where? To what? So that's interesting. The broad, flat stones underfoot were smeared with mud, but already drying in the heat. Dun-colored insects dancing on its surface, leaping from the path of Troll Sengar and his captors. So a new element being introduced in at the end, because now we're transitioning from Troll's perspective to suddenly action is actually happening. It's moved from a static image, as active as that image was described, but it was static. It was a still. It was, this is what this place looks like. And now we're actually moving into something happening. But before we get there, again, the broad flat stones, remember that the bodies had flat features. So there's a nice echo, a nice repetition coming here. The wall that they're walking on underfoot, smeared with mud. It's not clean. It's not nice. This is pretty grotty. But also, where did the mud come from? Had it come from below and been swept up? We know that the water is starting to breach the wall. Are there swells and tides? All of this is kind of being suggested that the top of this wall is covered with mud. We're told that the shoreline is silt. The silt is rising and building up. The bodies are building up. That we get a sense of this inexorable rise, not only of the water, but that this cannot be contained. It is pent up. It is trying to force its way through. And that's just suggested with the fact that some of it has already escaped. Some of it has already transitioned over this barrier and smeared it with mud. And then the dun-colored insects dancing on its surface. What would a prologue be? What would an Erikson novel be without insects? So again, it's a nice little tie-in to previous things. It gives the scene more activity. And also the idea that the insects are dancing, it's not pejorative. It's actually quite a nice image, which is weird to associate with insects, a bit of a juxtaposition, but it gives, again, that sense of activity to them, that there is life and death, this destruction, all of this cycle, the things that we've talked about before. And they're dun-colored. Dun, not gray, but again, a sort of a dull image. And these insects are leaping from the path. not leapt, not past tense, leaping. So again, this sense of activity, the sense of dynamic action, even within a very simple description. But obviously, the big thing here, Troll Sengar and his captors. And we saw from all these other preceding paragraphs that each time Erikson kind of introduced one new concept that was going to then be explored in a later paragraph. Trolls still experience difficulty comprehending that notion. Captors, a word he struggled with. They were his brothers, after all. Kin, faces he had known all his life, faces he had seen smile and laugh, and faces, at times, filled with a grief that had mirrored his own. He had stood at their sides through all that had happened, the glorious triumphs, the soul-wrenching losses. Captors. And this is in this, what is it, 3 sentences? So much is suddenly dumped on the reader. And the reason this doesn't feel like an exposition dump is because it's framed, or at least I would argue that because it is framed in this emotional sense, that we are with the thoughts rattling around in Troll's brain, that we are experiencing this with him struggling with the idea that not only is he a captive, that he is a prisoner, but the people who had made him prisoner are his brothers, his family. So they're in this, yes, he is feeling the sense of helplessness that you get from being a prisoner. He is feeling a sense of betrayal because how could someone he is related to make him into a prisoner? And at this point, have we seen something like this before, where a family member has imprisoned another family member? Erikson is connecting this back, at least I would argue that he is, to Tavor and Fellison. Even if this is not specifically linked, thematically, we have seen this almost exact scenario before. Fellison as a prisoner, Fellison in chains, Fellison betrayed by her sister, her family. You can, if you changed Troll's name to Fellison and the gender pronouns, you would have, they were her, let's say, sisters, after all, kin, faces she had known all her life, faces she had seen smile and laugh, and faces at times filled with a grief that had mirrored her own. She had stood at their sides through all that had happened, the glorious triumphs, the soul-wrenching losses. That could just as accurately describe Fellison. That sense of betrayal, that sense of hurt, that sense of how did this happen, the confusion, all of that is encapsulated in this one tiny little paragraph. We also get a sense here that Troll is not a child. First of all, the reference to the height was in man heights. So even if Troll is not a man, he is thinking in terms of how tall a man is. So it is subtly implying, it's embedding that notion in your brain that Troll is fully grown. We also have faces he had known all his life. So the implication, again, subtle, is that he has had a life. Of course, you know, that could be any length of time, but we tend to associate that more with a length of experience, an extended period of experience, which would suggest he is at least partially grown. Faces he had seen smile and laugh, and filled with a grief that mirrored his own. If you think of that in terms of experience, you know, the good times and the bad, children don't typically remember that, don't typically think in those ways. That's something more that adults do. So although none of these things specify that he is a grown man. All these things are subtly implied in the text. He had stood at their sides through all that had happened. So again, this idea that a lot of things have happened and he had always been there supporting them. The glorious triumphs, the soul-wrenching losses. So again, we're getting a sense of big things happening, terrible things happening, a wealth of experience, a breadth of experience, and all of that suggests age. All of that suggests that he is older. So unlike Fellowson, this is implying that Trull is fully grown. Is it confirmed? No, but this is the sense that you get from the text, the connotations, the weaving together of all of these subtle things inside, underneath the subtext. And then we have that beautiful contrast. There were no smiles now, no laughter. The expressions of those who held him were fixed and cold. Again, perfect description of what's going on. We have a contrast to what he remembered, the smiles, the laughter, and now he says there's no smiles, no laughter. So we've gone from the past in his memory to what he is experiencing and going, that's all gone, that's all changed. We're in a different time now. The expressions of those who held him were fixed and cold. And you go, so you can imagine that taciturn, that solemn expression. Perfect example. And then think back to how Erikson described what this land used to be like, that this used to be a cooler place. And we have smiling, laughter, all of these. These are warm emotions. And now they are cold emotions. So again, we have that nice juxtaposition, ringing the bell again, but this time an inverse. We then move down through this idea of Trull being chained. And so we're told all about these rings. Sorry, and this is where I'm moving away from doing a deep sort of language analysis. And I want to talk more now about the concepts that are being evoked here. So chains were wrapped around Trull Sengar, shackles hammered into place on his wrists and ankles, a studded girdle, iron loops, iron ring, hinged metal press. His mouth was forced open and the plate pushed in and locked in place over his tongue. This is a very medieval style, quite brutal, not torture, but on the edge of. But we've seen that in medieval pictures, and we've seen that about the thing to stop people speaking, these sort of gags that are put in place. But all of this idea of the being a captive, being a prisoner, and the chains. And of course, you know, we can't overlook the fact that this book is called House of Chains. That is already echoing in our mind. And here we have chains, rings, shackles, everything about this. So not only do we have that point of connection to fallacy, but we're seeing that all of these things that are happening here are echoing the title of the book. Is this what the book is going to be about? Who knows? This is just the prologue, but we can see these points of connection, these things being explored. So he is put in place, he's trussed up, he has all of these shackles and these chains, and then the shorning followed. And the thing is, shorning is a proper noun, capital S. This is a formal thing. This is not like going down to the barbers and getting shorn. Oh yeah, I got my hair shorn. He cut a lot off. This is a formal, the shorning. So there's something here that is ritualistic. There's something here that is formal. There's something here that is ceremonial. And we then get this quite brutal. Now, I would have to say, this is not gratuitous. This is not excessive language, nor is it overly gory, and nor is it fetishized. This is actually quite clinical in how it's describing it, because a dagger inscribed a circle on his forehead followed by a jagged slash to break that circle. The point pushed deep enough to gouge the bone, right? So we're getting a clear sense of what is happening. We're given an implication of how barbarous this is because words like gouge, jagged, but at the same time, this is not lingering over these descriptions. The narrator is not relishing this description. It's not being exaggerated or gazed at lovingly. Ash was rubbed into the wounds. Again, very straightforward, prosaic, mundane language. His long single braid was removed with rough hacks that made a bloody mess of his nape. So we can see this whole description. It is ceremonial. It's in a style of reportage that the narrator is taking a step back. This isn't emotive language. The tone here is one that is quite clinical. And then we have the shorning was an absolute thing, an irreversible act of severance. He was now an outcast. To his brothers, he had ceased to exist. He would not be mourned. His deeds would vanish from memory along with his name. His mother and father would have birthed one less child. This was for his people the most dire punishment, worse than execution by far. So now we get the full, almost the full implication of what this signifies. This is why this is such a ceremonial thing, because this is not just you're being banished, leave. This is you no longer exist. We are cutting from you everything that made you one of us. You no longer exist. You're being cut from the annals of history. You are being expunged. This is an absolute destruction of everything that makes us a person, our impact on the world, the relationships that we've had, the friends that we made along the way, all of that gone, even down to the fact that his parents would now no longer count him as a child that had ever been born. There will now be a Troll Sengar-shaped gap in that family's history, in that people's history. And that this is worse than simply being killed. Because at least if you're killed, you existed. You had an impact on the world. Now, the idea that he had an impact, no, that's been stripped away. He's not just dead to them. He never existed. Denial of existence. Now that's pretty cutting. So we get a sense of how devastating this is. And then it is followed up with a single line on its own. Yet, Troll Sengar had committed no crime. Ooh. The impact that that line has, understanding this significance now, someone being, their entire existence being removed from history and from memory. And he's innocent. This is, I think quite a powerful sort of scene. And then we think back again to Deadhouse Gates and Fellison and what we saw in that prologue, where Fellison was innocent. She didn't deserve to be sent as a slave to the Atadral mine. So we're seeing that point of comparison. But this is something, in some respects, even worse than what Fellison was sentenced to. Because here, he's being staked out on a wall in the middle of nowhere, being denied his existence. Yeah, he's not going to be sent to a work camp to be worked to death. He's just going to slowly die of dehydration. And no one is going to remember him. And he will never have existed. Fellison at least existed. But we then have this discussion between them. And it is preceded by, a discussion between his captors, where they ritualistically go through a sense of, now that we've already done this, what did he do? Oh, we will now do this. This is the last time any of them will ever acknowledge his existence. He's already been tried and convicted. The sentence has been carried out. And now we have a confirmation of that trial. And we get a sense that his crime, as implied, is that he spoke out against one of the speakers, who was his brother. He spoke out against me, that your ambition would lead us all to our deaths. By his own tongue, he accused me of betraying our people. And have I? They're having this whole discussion between them in a very ritualistic manner, where they've already carried out the sentence. None of this is all just grandiose to rub salt in the wounds of the person who is there, who has been punished. Troll is having to listen without the ability to talk back, without the ability to answer back. He is having to listen to these trumped up charges, to all of this discussion between his brothers. No ability to argue back after the sentence has been carried out. This is all grandstanding. And that tells you a lot, either about the culture or specifically about the brother speaking. And so we get through this whole list of all of these things that they are basically accusing him of, and then they go, yeah, we're going to leave. And then Trull is left on his own. The sea rustled the corpses along the shoreline. Crabs scuttled. Water continued to seep through the mortar, insulate the cyclopean wall with the voice of muttering ghosts, and flow down on the other side. Among his people, it was a long-known truth, perhaps the only truth, that nature fought but one eternal war, one foe. That further to understand this was to understand the world, every world. So I just want to talk about this section now. Trull has had to listen to his brothers accuse him of all of these things after the fact. And then he has been left, and he has been left bound on a wall, on this border, in this liminal space, in this transitional space, in the nascent, on the border of the nascent, on the verge of the nascent. In all of these spaces, he is on the wall that is the shoreline. This is the moment. He is not part of them anymore, but he is not yet dead. He is in a period of transition, a moment of transition. He has been left in this borderland. And this is the beginning of a story. So we have this point, someone left as a prisoner who has been left in nowhere, in this limbo between two areas. We have a sense of the ghosts in the wall because of just the sound of the water. Mud, stone. So again, this is dirty, this is horrible, this is not nice. And Trull is there, and all he can think about, following all of this, when he's trying to understand it, he's thinking that nature has but one enemy, and that is imbalance. That everything should be in balance. That everything should be working simpatico. And something has disrupted this. And in this prologue, let's think about the imbalances. We had the civilized world of the houses are now being drowned, an imbalance. This rent in the sky allowed one place to invade another. There's an imbalance. We had the tropical storms being created because these different forces were colliding, and there was an imbalance. Why did the storms cease? Because eventually the pressure equalized. Once the world is brought into balance, then everything can stop. Everything can settle down. And here we have the water is rising against this wall. The pressure is building up. And while we would use the expression, nature abhors a vacuum, nature also abhors being pent up and held back. That pressure is going to keep growing, becoming more and more powerful. The wall held the sea, and that sea is going to push and push and push on this barrier, this unnatural barrier that has been created to hold back and constrain nature. And nature will try to break through. And this is kind of where we leave this whole scene. We have seen how Troll's images and his thoughts have shaped this description of what's going on. And we're left with this. The wall is holding the sea for now. This was a flood that would not be denied. The deluge had but just begun. Something his brothers could not understand, would perhaps never understand. Drowning was common among his people. Drowning was not feared, and so Troll Sengar would drown. Soon. And before long, he suspected his entire people would join him. His brother had shattered the balance, and nature shall not abide. And that's how this section closes. This idea of powerful natural forces that have been put out of balance by the actions of individuals. When people interfere with nature, nature shall not abide. When people interfere and create rents in warrens, nature shall not abide. That destruction is coming, that change is coming, that cataclysm is coming. This is all portentous. And so we have the literal description of what happened to Troll being connected to this grander theme of transition, the fear of an oncoming cataclysm or apocalypse, the idea of the power of nature, and how, when we interfere with that, when we meddle with it, we might contain it for a while. But as they said in Jurassic Park, nature always finds a way. And we also have these thematic links and narrative links to Dead House Gates, all signaled in this prologue. And contained in all of this, obviously, is the link to the title, the House of Chains. We have all of these chains. Everything is built up in this prologue. And this sense of tension, impending disaster, this is setting us up for a book that is potentially explosive. So I hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.